Hello, this is Philip Williams here in my Library of the Historical Sciences, recording for you the first of my long awaited podcasts. Now, I know that many of you are wanting an update on the Mount Ararat discovery, this structure near the top of Mount Ararat that looks like the remains of Noah's Ark. And I'm going to update you about that. But in this first podcast, I want to explain to you how I knew that this discovery was almost certainly the remains of Noah's Ark the first time I heard of it and looked into it. And I want you to have that same understanding. And that will require uh, teaching you a new narrative about the historical sciences, how we understand the ancient world. And that's the name of this new narrative is Ancient Light, which is also the name of this podcast. The narrative that I want to teach you, called Ancient Light, is, of course, about it's a new narrative. Number one, it's also about the origins of mankind and the universe, the kind of thing that we either learn maybe from the Bible or nowadays most people understand this, where we came from, where the universe came from, where man came from science. Now, let's focus on this word narrative. You might be hearing the word narrative being used a lot today, especially concerning political narratives. There are two political narratives that dominate the discussion in most of the media today concerning political matters. One would be the Republican narrative that many of you subscribe to. It's what you hear on Fox News, and then others you may subscribe to the narrative that's presented in the mainstream media. The New York Times is a newspaper of record, and that it generally carries the mainstream news narrative, and of course it's associated with blue states. And the news, every topic in the news is covered or not covered, depending on which narrative you are listening to or buying into, and then the same events will be put in a different light depending on the narrative, the political narrative you're using. And then there's also scientific narratives. To give an example, today, just recently, there's been a lot of discussion about the origin of COVID, and we look to science for in our modern world. We look to science for the answers. One answer is that the original we heard is it came from a wet market from wild animals. And then there's another skeptical narrative that this came from a lab leak. And there, to some extent, these scientific narratives follow the political narrative because there's a close connection between science and government, or science and skepticism of government. And of course, there's also probably an even more dominant narrative today concerns climate change. The traditional narrative on climate change, the one I learned when I was a young person in school, was it's caused by the sun with natural cycles, and when it comes to climate change, if you've studied the matter of Noah's flood or ancient history that might relate to that, you know something about how climate has changed over the years. I think we're going to talk about that in the new narrative. But nowadays, the big narrative about climate change is that it's due to man-made carbon, and that it even threatens life on Earth. Now, in fact, this has become a very powerful narrative that even crosses, to a great extent, it crosses the political narrative. So it's become exactly that dominant. But let's talk a little bit about narratives in general. Uh, they're very useful. They're very important. They give you a way of understanding and remembering evidence. Now, whether you're understanding it in the right way or the wrong way, you have a way of slotting things that you hear. Um, if you don't have a narrative to remember things, you will forget them. You won't remember them, and then you'll have a hard time learning new things. Now that's really important because I'm going to teach you a lot of new things in these podcasts, and you need a narrative uh, in order to remember them. Because you might say narratives are the light by which we see and remember things. So narratives are necessary, whether they're a truthful narrative or whether they're distorting the truth or giving us the truth. They're important, and they help you remember otherwise isolated facts. So if you're going to really be a knowledgeable person, you're going to have a narrative to slot things in, and then maybe someday you'll change your narrative, but you can still remember the things that you learned in the old narrative, so that even a bad narrative is useful. Um, and then, of course, there's a cases which one of these narratives is a truthful one, and we can only do that by comparing them, because you have to look at things in one light. But when you're looking at two competing narratives about things, how you either have to look at it in one light or looking at it the other light. So it's I'm going to teach you a little bit how to judge competing narratives. But there's entire schools of education that are built on certain big narratives, and of course, Origins is one of them, and also how we understand the Bible, how do we understand what the Bible teaches about the ancient world and the creation, and it competes with scientific. But these three narratives. Now, when I'm talking about three narratives, one of these narratives is the one I'm going to teach you, which is a new narrative. And if you can teach this new narrative, well, by understanding this new narrative, you will better understand the previous narrative. You will better understand the scientific narrative, and you will also understand a very popular biblical narrative about the ancient world. And so you'll understand what others believe, but then this new narrative, I hope you will. Well, I know you will see that it shows the facts in a much better way. Now, um, there's an interesting thing. Narratives have to be funded if they're going to be if they're going to be spread and taught. Um, did you know scientific narratives require funding? And that funding may influence the scientific narrative. I don't think that's news to you, whether it's true or not. But we have to pay for the science that we get, or the narratives that we get, even if we get them from say from someplace other than the official scientific way. Though, of course, we might not get what we pay for. In fact, we might, instead of paying for truth, we might be actually paying to 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 this, to put us in darkness. Now, the current world is unusually because it's unlike previous ages. Previous ages have looked back to the ancestors, or look back to the fathers and those who brought them to get wisdom. But in our current world, we look to the latest. We look down on the past, and we look to us as an enlightened age. And if we are enlightened, then that narrative is okay. But if it turns out what we're believing is not true, we might be living in a time of great darkness rather than a time of enlightenment. Now, very important, scientific funding mostly comes from the government. They're paid for by taxes and fees. Well, today there's a lot of private foundations that do scientific funding, but to a great extent, even these private foundations uh, will be in line with the narratives that are given to us by the government. Um, and very important, the world we live in, we people believe what they do because the government funding teachings have taught them to believe these things. And government is very are very powerful and they're very influential, and they it's different depending on where you live. If you're in, say, if you live in Russia, you might have a different narrative about the war in Ukraine than if you lived in the West or the United States. Now that's concerned a political matter, but there's it concerns everything where you live or the circle that you live in, the people that you talk to regularly, and you get your information from. They will determine the narrative you believe. Now, today we're in an era, we're in a secular era where the schools, colleges, and scientific institutions, hospitals, everything is mostly funded by the government. Now, in previous times, schools, colleges, and institutions were funded by the churches. In fact, science arose at a time or the modern science arose in a time when science was funded by the churches, or sometime, of course, the European states had official government, so there was a close connection between the government funding and the church funding. But in early America, the governments were funded, or the schools and colleges, universities, they were all funded by the churches, and eventually they became secular. But I just wanted to mention that the church is an alternative funding for teaching science, even. Now, I want to say something about truth now, because if something is true, it has a power. It can enlighten. It can do things. What I think it was Francis Bacon who talked about the power of truth, and so it does have a power that's can compete with that which isn't truth. Uh, and I'm going to refer to the church of those who love truth. Now, I'm a Christian, and I believe that Christianity is founded on truth. If it's not, it's a false faith. Not all religions necessarily concern themselves with truth. They concern. There are other things that they're interested in, but the scriptures claim to be, the apostles claim to be teaching the truth. And if it's not truth, then there's no foundation for the Christian faith. But even though we're Christians, we might not be fully committed to the truth. So I'm going to be speaking to those who do love the truth. And the Church of the Truth can change the narratives taught by the governments. In fact, to some extent, it might be able to change the narrative that's not totally truth, but we're looking for that which is truly truth, if I could put it that way. Now, let's now talk about, limit ourselves to the narrative concerning where the world came from and where we came from. And there are three, there are competing narratives about origins, where we came from. If you're a Christian, you know that there's a competing narrative. Of course, one now, the most popular one that the world subscribes to, is the one taught in mainstream science. And if you're not aware of this, and nobody taught me this when I was a young Christian, but you go to the universities today to learn that the Bible isn't true. And you haven't gotten a good education if you haven't been taught that. So that, but of course, if you are a person of faith, that presents a dilemma. Or, how do you fit the biblical narrative? What you really believe? How do you fit it in what seems to be the scientific case about origins? Now, one school has arisen to challenge mainstream science. It's not as new as you might think. In fact, it didn't exist when I was uh, a young person, a young Christian. It only became popular in the '60s, and it was taught through the homeschools. But now, perhaps, well, the majority of evangelicals now, I believe, subscribe to the School of Creation Science, and we're going to talk about that. I'm going to also present that. But the main narrative that is different from both what's taught in mainstream science and what's taught in creation science is, well, what I want to teach you is a new narrative called ancient life. Now, I originally called it scripture science, but that presented a problem because everybody thinks they understand the scriptures, and they won't necessarily like the way you teach the scriptures. So I went for the more neutral term, ancient light, which it is. It's uh, um, the well, that's appropriate name. Now let's go to the first big narrative, the one that you learn when you go to the universe, and you learn that the Bible isn't telling you the truth about the ancient world and the ancient man. In fact, you see here a picture of a snowy background, and then you see these large hairy elephants and another large hairy animal looks like a huge rhinoceros, and then you see some large type of cat looks like he's eating some kind of deer, and then in the upper left hand corner you see maybe some horses there. But everything these look like animals that we still see today, except they're a bit larger. In fact, to some extent, quite a bit larger. In fact, the scientists call these the megafauna. And the megafauna became extinct after the Ice Age, and that's an interesting thing. Just keep that in mind. But you had the world with these animals, and what's important about this is also where mankind first appears. What we call the cavemen, and you see these cavemen with spears. It looks like a very large bear. A large cave bear is coming out of this cave, and they have to either protect themselves or perhaps they want to kill that bear and make a rug out of it for the caves in which they live in. And of course, we see here in the picture on the left, and these cavemen is they learned how to make fire. And when you hear the scientific story of man, learning to make fire is the first thing that distinguishes men from the animal. Now, the mainstream teaches, of course, that men a man shares a common ancestor with the higher primates or the monkeys and the apes, and but then they became fully men in the Ice Age. Now, a lot of Christians, well, and of course I'm one of them, we don't accept such an evolutionary view of men. But then we still have the problem that we have men here in this Ice Age period, which dates. Originally, it was believed to date a few 100,000 years, but now this has been pushed back to several million years. So, what if you're a Bible believer? What do you do about this? But let's summarize the mainstream scientific narrative. Uh, First of all, here man when he appears, and then in the Bible, Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, you see they're starting as farmers, and they also have domesticated animals. But according to the scientific narratives, mankind lived on the earth for several million years in these small bands of what they call hunter gatherers. In other words, they didn't grow or domesticate any kind of animal. They just went around and got whatever wild things they could do. And because the things are easily depleted, they have to keep moving out. That's a remarkable story that men could exist for so long without learning how to farm or how to herd animals. But that's the scientific narrative. Then um, well, but if you learn this, and it presents a real problem for your faith, because how do you fit Adam and Eve, and how do you fit Noah and the flood and all that into man that's were on the earth that long ago, a million years ago, or even 150,000 years ago? How do you fit the account in the Bible? Does the Bible give any indication on that? And some people search ways to sort of harmonize the biblical view with the scientific view, but a lot of people, they think about evolution as being the problem, but that's really not the main problem. The main problem is the very fact that mankind is supposed to have been on Earth. So, how do you fit that into the biblical narrative? And in fact, that the antiquity of man actually came before the evolutionary view of man. In fact, it was first proclaimed on the very date that Darwin presented his theory about the evolution, the origin of species. But at that time, they wasn't connected because Darwin didn't address at that time the evolution of man. But this antiquity of man certainly set the stage for the evolution of man. And then the next stage in the scientific account of man is agriculture, which follows the Ice Age. And it was believed to begin in the Fertile Crescent. That's an area that extends from Israel and up into Syria and down into Mesopotamia, where the earliest agriculture and the earliest domestication of sheep and goats and wheat and barley began. So the agriculture is the next stage, and then following this several thousand years of agriculture, then cities, villages, agriculture villages turned into cities, and a rather advanced civilization occurred following agriculture. It's called the Early Bronze Age, and when you look at the civilization of the Early Bronze Age, they are remarkable. They're very advanced. In fact, it's just all kind of mysteries, because we see what looks like these ancient civilizations that somehow vanished. Then how does the mainstream science deal with the story of the flood in the Bible? Well, they have found stories like the one in the Bible in some of these texts dating from the Bronze Age, and the presumption is that the writer of the Bible developed their own story of the flood from that. Now, there's stories of the flood all over the world by different nations, but apparently only the people who gave us the Bible didn't have their own account of the flood, so they had to borrow it. So nowadays you will hear it popularly taught that the Bible is based on Bronze Age myth. And of course, there's also, one of the presumptions there is there couldn't have been floods because there's so many scientific problems with the flood. But because there is in the scientific view, there's no evidence of a worldwide flood, or the mainstream scientific view, then these problems are really not looked at very carefully. It's just dismissed without searching that. Now, there is, as I mentioned, an alternative narrative, which is now believed by most evangelical, and it's called creation science, and it was originally called flood geology, and it's the only narrative for the last 100 years that's given us an explanation of the worldwide flood. So naturally, it's one that Christians would look to, but it's based on the notion that the days in Genesis were 24 hours in duration, and that results in the young Earth. Sometimes it's called young Earth creationism. But the main thesis of this is that the days of creation were exactly 24 hours, or approximately 24 hours in duration, and in this narrative, the flood is used to explain why we find these buried fossils buried deep within the earth, like dinosaurs and other animals that don't even roam the earth today. And the notion is that they were wiped out by the flood. But not all of them, because according to this model, some of the dinosaurs these animals were on the ark, and they were preserved. So we had dinosaurs after the flood, according to the creation science narrative. But the truth is, the creation science narrative is mostly a fish killing flood. In fact, it's 95% more than 95% of the victims of the flood are fish, which is a little strange if you look at the biblical narrative, because of course the flood was brought about because of the wickedness of man, and it also is going to destroy everything that moves along the earth. But there's nothing said about it killing the fish. In fact, the fish didn't even need to be brought into the ark. And on the top of that, though it has plenty of evidence of fish killed in the flood, there's little or no evidence that the creation science can point to of the people who died in the flood. So it's a little odd. In fact, another thing is, for some reason, they're according to the creation science narrative, all human beings or human remains date till after the flood, because somehow the flood destroyed all the evidence of humans. So, but therefore, everything pertaining to man, from what's now seen as the Ice Age, everything it had to come after the flood. But creationists aren't able to trace to show you exactly how men came from the ark to where the historical nations currently exist. So it's not providing us a lot of light on helping us understand that. And another problem with this discovery that I have visited near the top of Mount Ararat is the mountain itself Mount Ararat sits on top of the young Earth flood evidence. Now, how could the mountain even be there if it was, it couldn't have been there with the flood creating the foundation on which the mountain sits. So the young Earth creationists teach that Mount Ararat itself was a post-flood. It's a volcano that came out after the flood. So even though they believe in the flood and they believe in Noah's Ark, they want to find that they want to believe that the Ark landed someplace else on other than Mount Ararat. Thus, the creationists have been the chief opponents of this discovery. So you see right now the problems that this discovery is encountering, because the only people, just about the only people who believe in the flood, the notion of the Ark being on Mount Ararat, is undermining the creation science narrative. Now, creation science teaches that it's really following the Bible rather than science. But I just want to point to you, there are a lot of similarities. In fact, the creation science also, they love to be scientific, though they like true science, what they teach. But both the mainstream science and the creation science, they understand the Earth's origins based on the Newtonian way. It's really how Isaac Newton was asked about the creation account in the Bible, and he said, well, that's how the world would have looked from an observer that was standing on the earth, a human observer standing on the earth. And so this, by the way, this whole issue of the age of the earth begins with Newton, because the question was asked Newton, how could the world be created using your principles that you found, scientific principle, and yet still and be created in 6 days, in that short period of time? So Newton gave several answers to that, but science has generally, the interpretation of the Bible since Newton has generally followed that. To put it in different terms, Newton said that space and time were the sensorium of God, and he postulated this absolute space and time in which God created. In this time, the time existed independently, and God created it at some point in time, and so it was the point of view of a human looking at the creation, um, rather than a transcendent creator. In other words, those days are dramatic. Now, another thing is both mainstream and science and creation science teach an ice age, and that's the whole notion of ice age has going to have a great impact on how we on the new narrative. Um, but neither mainstream science nor creation science can show us the people who died in the flood. Or for that matter, the land animals who died in the flood. They can show us a dinosaur, and they can show us a fish, and maybe some other kinds of extinct animals. But the modern animals are neither the current scientific view nor the creation science. But that's not accidental, because the creation science really just tried to rearrange the mainstream scientific view and to conform to a 6-day creation, and that really kind of summarizes creation science. Neither view have an archaeological understanding of the worldwide flood, and that will explain to where my work is so important. And neither, of course, can trace where, say, the American natives how they got from Noah's Ark to America, or the people in Africa, or the people in China, or the people in Europe. They don't have a historical understanding. And of course, neither can explain this. That little wooden nail that holds these boards together that I have my hand on, and this structure up on Mount Ararat looks at Mount. It looks like Noah's Ark. It's how does science, which doesn't have an understanding of the flood, you know, here's the biblical artist depicting the biblical picture of the flood, all these drowned people. But if we can't find any evidence of these drowned people, now maybe all their bodies decayed and rotted away, but how about their houses? How about their tools? How about their weapons? It was a violent time. Why don't we find any of this? And nobody has given us an answer to this question. Of course, when I retired, and my work is in science, and I'm used to checking out things. Is it really true? And in my scientific work, I never found anything. And I was always, when I found a new innovation, and which helped bring in this digital network we use and fiber optics. You were always having to challenge what people already believed. And so everything I have done scientifically has always been controversial. So I'm accustomed to controversy. And if you're in a new innovative science, you're going to be accustomed to controversy. So expect, if you're involved in what I'm doing, you're going to be involved in controversy. But I said, okay, maybe they say there's no evidence of the flood, no evidence in the human remains of flood, but let me check this out. I have the time to do it. I have the ability to do it. So I said, well, what would be real evidence of the flood? I wasn't sure about this flood science. It was a long time ago. Nobody lived, and some things about the creation science flood model sounds good, and other things I see problems. But you really get into problems with the creation science narrative when you talk about people, when you talk about archaeology, which are the material remains of man. But I say, but you should see in the material remains of man, if there was a flood in the third millennium, when the Bible says, you should see people disappearing. So I decided to go about and searching all these ancient texts, like here in the Cambridge History of Ancient Man, searching for evidence of a flood in the third millennium before Christ. And I thought I saw something like that in the third millennium, but it was hard to tell because I didn't at that time have a lot of experience in in this subject. I was coming from a purely scientific rather than historical experience. And then then we should see a new migration of the nations after the flood, if there was a flood. And we're told that there was no such secondary migration. We're told confidently by the people in the mainstream science that there's no such thing. And then if I did see a new migration, just to be sure that I'm not seeing things, I want to make sure that this is a really distinct new culture that's coming about. Everything that happens after this third millennium should look really differently in the material culture from that which went before. That was a criteria. I didn't even think to look at the fourth thing, which is the evidence of people and humans and civilizations who might have perished in the flood. And but when I was trying to figure out how these things connected, I realized I was studying some of these historical nations, and I realized that that they were not as currently taught religious burials, but they were. I was actually looking at the people who perished in the flood. But this is something that I knew, that you can look at evidence, and if you're looking at it in the wrong light, you won't recognize what you're looking at. So that coming from my scientific experience. I'm just skeptical. Anything scientific, I'm going to be. Now, if you really don't have experience in science, you're going to be humble about what you know, and you're going to be skeptical about what other people teach you. It's just the way it works. And of course, some of y'all know that I published this book back. I was getting ready to publish this book, which I found the evidence of the flood, and also you see on the path of the left the migrations of the people after the flood, which were based on primarily on archaeology, but on other things like language and genetics. And in fact, I was able to connect these to the map you see on the left is called the table from the Table of Nations in Genesis, how Noah's family migrated. And then the one on the right is actually from an archaeological book from Israel, explaining how this new culture goes down in Israel, and it's called one of the terms used for it down there is called Kerak, but it just strangely appears out of nowhere after the people in Israel have disappeared. And you see from the arrows that it's coming from a river up there north called Araxes. Well, that's just north of Mount Ararat. In fact, it looked like that arrow actually starts on Mount Ararat. So I knew immediately that the ark had to be right there. And this is a picture that I took of Mount Ararat on the day I visited this old ship up on top of the mountain. Now, let's go down now to the new narrative I want to teach you, the third narrative about the ancient world, which I'm calling Ancient Light. This and by the way, this book that I published this past year called Ancient Light from This Mountain, you can see the bold subtitle there, a book that will change the world. I actually wrote this book to teach the scientists how to understand the archaeology. But I think it's written in a way that you'll be able to understand this book when you listen to a few of these podcasts. And of course, the scientists will be able, and actually, the scientists. It's interesting about this discovery. The Christians have been up in arms. Most of them have been been involved with. Have been up in arms about this discovery because it challenges the narratives. But the mainstream scientists, I don't have any problem. In fact, they're very interested in it. Is this really? I mean, they understand how we can prove whether this is the actual ark, if what we find in the structure is matching what we find in these migrations, or that it's not. In other words, we can all, if you don't understand what if it's really Noah's Ark should look like, then you can understand if it's not Noah's Ark. So we have a means of testing this, but you need to understand the new narrative to be able to to be able to make that test. And now here's some of the things about the new narrative. Of course, it's about origins, and very important. I'm going to be talking a lot about Ice Age. I've already mentioned some things about the Ice Age, but according to this new narrative, the world never experienced an Ice Age. Now, I'm challenging both the mainstream scientists and the and the creation scientists about this Ice Age, so they can work together in trying to refute them. I want them, if it can be refuted, I want to see that. So, I'm pretty confident in it, or I wouldn't have moved forward with this. Um, well, let me just to put it in other words, the geological evidence, the real geological evidence of the worldwide flood is not what the creationists have been teaching us. But the evidence has been falsely explained as an ice age. Now, that wasn't always the case. In the early 19th century, when the very man that invented the word geology also it looked at this evidence that we're now using in the ice age, but nobody was speaking of ice age then. And he said the only way we can explain this is that is a worldwide flood. A flood somehow occurred and caused this evidence, which is near the surface of the earth, but it's all jumbled together. And you couldn't explain this by normal geological processes, so they called it the diluvium. And geological science was actually beginning with this teaching of the diluvium. And in fact, the American Journal of Science, the oldest scientific journal in America, was founded on this diluvium geology. Now, it was one of the consequences of this is I'm going to show it was the fact that there was no rain before the flood. But there was a different type of watering cycle. The water was actually coming. In fact, the people from before the flood, a lot of them lived in what are now deserts in Arabia and Saudi Arabia, or even in the American Southwest. And they primarily lived along rivers, but the water was coming from beneath the earth. There's still some of these aquifers that still exist. This really challenges the geology, but I'll explain to you exactly that was in fact the case, and it's in line with the evidence the scientific evidence. And of course, there was something really big happened in the human civilizations, and all this megafauna suddenly disappeared, and now instead of having people well-watered gardens in Arabia and the Sahara Desert and the American Southwest, we now have deserts. In fact, currently the evaporation from the tropics, it spreads out and it expands, and it just moves over the desert until it gets to the colder temperatures in the north and what's called the temperate, and then the rain drops, so we get rain here. So this cycle, which apparently had to do with the same explanation that scientists use to try to explain the ice age, but because they see this change occurring, which has to do with the tilt of the earth, it's a different hydrological cycle today. And of course, the megafauna, all these big animals were wiped out by Noah's flood in the narrative that I'm giving you. And very important, we can trace the nations from Mount Ararat, the historical nation, and confirm that this is likely Noah's Ark. Now, more things that this narrative teaches is of course, the drowned prehistoric civilizations are falsely explained as religious burials. Now, I'm having a lot of fun with this, and once the archaeologists get this in their mind, it ruins them, because they can no longer look at these prehistorical burials, which are obviously, they're not elaborate religious burials. It's just no way that you can explain why the whole world went mad doing nothing but building graves. They couldn't have possibly done that, but you can very easily explain, even by the way the people are informally laid out, that they actually drowned. And of course, the consequences of this, and this is why I haven't, even those of you who have been following my work on the flood, but I haven't dealt with this question about the Ice Age really until this recent book, in which I can demonstrate that all the evidence of mankind's, this cavemen and what they call the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age men and the Neolithic or the New Stone Age man, and as well as the very advanced early Bronze Age, all existed at about the same time in this 1600, the same as you can find in Ussher's dating of the Bibles, around less than 2,000 years from Adam to Noah. And that's really it's shaking. I mean, now of course people are going to ask, "Oh, how about the radiocarbon dating and all this?" And I actually believe in radiocarbon dating and use the radiocarbon dating, but the ones that date these sites, the dating of these sites was done before the appearance of radiocarbon dating, and no, and and I'll explain to you how I predicted in my first book that the dating of the early sites of man are going to get pushed back towards infinity, because you get funding from attention and people are interested in the earliest this or earliest temple, the earliest city, the earliest civilization. So the earliest evidence of man in America. Right, in this past week, there was a lot of attention given to a site up in Canada about that. So the funding is going to push the dates, archaeological dates, back towards just going to keep getting older. But in fact, they're not that old. They're only about all the evidence of man is probably no more than about 6,000 years, and we have we have some of the world's top radiocarbon dating laboratories working on this, and they understand more than anyone, and you have to understand that there's a lot of dates you can get from radiocarbon datings, and if it doesn't fit the narrative, they're probably going to be rejected. And so that's the conclusion. And of course, now there's another part of this new narrative in teaching where the water comes from, and that's almost an independent search that I made. And when I realized why are the continents floating above the oceans, since rocks are heavier than water, and then I realized that the interior of the earth had to be water. And since I published my original book, that's been confirmed. I predicted in 2011 publication that there's more water under the continents than in the oceans. And just a few years later, we learned there's more water under North America alone than all the Earth's oceans. But they still haven't explained how that how the water got down there, how the water got under the continents, and you have to understand the physics of how the properties of matter under high temperatures and pressures. And I was fortunate to work in a laboratory on testing the properties of materials when I was in college, and my professor wanted me to join him in being one of the space scientists and developing the nose cones. But I did realize that we really don't know. He taught me that we really don't know what things are, and it could be that water under these high pressures and temperatures is actually heavier than rock, and that is the case. And I use that to explain the origins of the Earth. Now, as I'm saying, these are not human days, as the creationists teach, but they are God's days. It was God who was working during that period. And but I'm going to challenge the mainstream science, and I believe that the Earth, however old it is about the same age as the universe. Now that's following the teachings of the scriptures. And I'm also will point to some of the evidence about how old our own galaxy is. It seems to be about as old as the universe, is pointing to the same conclusion. And just want to mention the fact that ancient man, or all the philosophical understandings, they couldn't conceive of why the world would exist without man. So, for example, Aristotle thought that man had already always been around, but the Bible teaches that there were worlds before man, and these can have, even before modern science, these were sometimes church theologians took this seriously. And but this new narrative, it's about science, but since science informs our world, a new narrative can change the world. And if you'll learn this narrative and teach it to your friends together, we can change the world in a very good way. And I thank you for watching this first podcast.